Dames en heren, welkom vanavond bij dit online ViaJacobidebat, waarin professor Beatrice de Graaf en professor Sir Richard J. Evans met elkaar in gesprek gaan over waarheid, fake news en complottheorieën. De positie van de historicus in dat krachtenveld en hoe de historicus een belangrijke rol kan spelen in het ontkrachten en het ontkrachten van fake news en het in stand houden van de waarheid. Dit debat zal verder helemaal in het Engels plaatsvinden, omdat het een primeur is vanavond. Voor het eerst hebben we een gesprek tussen een Nederlandse en een Engelstalige spreker. En daarom zal ik vanaf nu overschakelen in het Engels. Ik wens u een hele fijne avond. Welcome all to this ViaJacobidebat, or in the truth of the name of this church, in which Beatrice has a background said already, the St. James's Church in Utrecht. The ViaJacobidebat discusses everything in and around society, and today we have a meeting and a discussion about fake news, truth and conspiracy theories, and the position of the historian as the ultimate mythbuster. Is this the case, and how? We have two very esteemed colleagues. I will introduce the main speaker of the evening and the interviewer of the other speaker, and I'll start by introducing Professor Beatrice de Graaf. And she will introduce the other speaker, namely Professor Sir Richard J. Evans. I welcome both of them because they're very esteemed historians, and it's very good to have you here, both of you. And I also would like to let you know that this debate was organized in cooperation with Utrecht Bookstore Cruze. We've worked together on multiple occasions, and we've been doing this for 15 years almost, and it's very glad to see even in this day and age, new ways of having a debate still. After this, Professor de Graaf will introduce the speaker, whom she will introduce. She will introduce Professor Sir Richard Evans. And then, in the meantime, you can all leave your questions in the chat function in the YouTube channel. Sensible questions will be sent through to the speakers, and they will be answered at the end of the session. So don't worry if you have a very good question. Do not hesitate to leave it in the comments, and we will put them forward to the speakers, and they will debate further. The session will conclude about 9:15, 9:30. In English time is 8:30 in the evening when we will conclude this meeting. So first off, Professor Beatrice de Graaf, historian, researcher, and distinguished professor at Utrecht University, chair of the Faculty of Humanities at the Department of Modern History. She focuses her research on how societies and states aim to maintain high levels of security and how these are related to core values and institutions in these societies and states, as well as how and by what means these security arrangements have been threatened since the 19th century, particularly since 1815, after the period of Napoleon. In particular, she's researched the role of terrorism in recent years as a threat to security and the role that fake news plays in this regard. In 2018, she was granted the Steven Science Grant, which is the highest distinguished honor that a scientist in the Netherlands can obtain. And in the clip that was promoting her grant, she signaled the loss of factfulness as a serious threat that she was very intrigued by, with fake news being on the rise in contemporary media and society. According to her, the basis for our progression, for our current society, and the core of the Age of Enlightenment itself has always been to strive to arrange all the facts in a correct way, and to find the right causal links between those facts in order to discuss all that and conclude this is what happens. Today, this seems to have turned on its head completely, making it no longer about facts, but about drama. Recently, she published Fighting Terror After Napoleon, about how Europe became secure after 1815. And she's also a bit of a debater in residence. Not only is she a member of the St. James Church, but she's been with us multiple times. And she's always been a very welcome guest in our debate. So once again, welcome. And I give the floor to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I'm especially proud and honored to have Sir Evans in our midst tonight, Richard. He is one of the most renowned historians in the world, and not just in the wider world, but here in Utrecht as well, because many of your books, Richard, are being used for our first year students at Utrecht University, where I also teach the first year undergraduate course, partly on the basis of your books. You were Regius Professor of History at the University of Cambridge from 2008 until your retirement. You were appointed Knight for services to scholarship. And historians and amateur historians alike will know you from your manifold books about the Third Reich, the series. Another very interesting book, Altered Pasts, Counterfactuals in History. I personally really like your book, Pursuit of Power, about the long 19th century history of Europe. And of course, your famous book, Death in Hamburg from 1987, which was a very prescient book because it deals with how societies cope with pandemics, with the cholera in Hamburg. What I also find so very striking and impressive about your career, Richard, is that you do not only write books, but also directly intervene in public debate, what we would call applied history. You have been awarded several prizes and distinctions for your engagement in debates on school curriculum, on commemoration of the First World War, and you were also principal expert witness in the David Irving libel trials, and moreover you're advisor to the government on claims for the return of looted artwork from the Nazi era. So today we'll be most happy if you share with us some of the insights that you wrote down in your book, The Hitler Conspiracies. This is the Dutch part. There is a website opened up by the Bruce bookstore in Utrecht where your books are being showcased, and I urge people to go there after your speak to read more about your work. You will lead us now into the world of mirrors, myths, fake news, and conspiracy theories that persist to swirl around the history of Hitler, the Third Reich, and the Nazis. And I almost forgot to add to that this is not the one-off book on conspiracies. You have set up a very influential and very important research center on conspiracy and democracy in Cambridge, which has been the site for many an interesting and productive debate on how conspiracies are related to democracy and how they undermine democracy. But for now, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for that very generous introduction. And thank you for inviting me to this interesting discussion. It circles around the book that I wrote that you just showed in English called The Hitler Conspiracies, but I'm pleased to say it's also been published in Dutch, like my 3 volumes on the history of the Third Reich. And when I was researching the history of the Third Reich, I found it very striking towards the end of the project, 2007, 2008, to note that conspiracy theories about Hitler and Nazi Germany were coming back. There were some new ones, but there were also some old ones which are being revived. And I found this a very curious phenomenon and wanted to know more about it. So in addition, as you know, there were many conspiracy theories flying around Europe in the aftermath of Napoleon. And in fact, 2 books by Adam Zamoyski and a much earlier one by John Roberts have treated those as conspiracy theories with very little basis in fact. And so I was writing my history of 19th century Europe, which has also appeared in Dutch, I'm very pleased to say. That re-emergence of conspiracy theory struck me again. So I got a grant from the Leverhulme Trust to study conspiracy theories, about which I knew very little in the beginning. And we had a wonderful team, excuse me, of postdoctoral researchers, 2 great colleagues, John Norton, internet engineer, and David Runciman, the political theorist, scientist, political scientist. We were also able to invite many distinguished guests to speak, including yourself, of course, Beatrice. So what I tried to do in this book is to marry the two, is to look at conspiracy theories about the Third Reich, or that have allegedly influenced the Third Reich and influenced Hitler, look at them skeptically and in the light of the much more general scientific literature on conspiracy theories of all kinds. And of course, all our visiting speakers and our postdoctoral researchers all fed into this project. So this is my part of it. What I did was to pick some of the a small sample of conspiracy theories. There were 5 in all. 2 of these were said to have had a strong influence on Hitler and the Third Reich. One is a falsified, forged concoction called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It was put together in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century and was said to be, to quote the title of the first person to give it a serious investigation, Norman Cohn, a warrant for genocide. It's huge claims have been made for this small document that it inspired the Holocaust, for example. It is a forgery, as I said, so it's a concoction made in Russia in 1903 that claims to be the minutes of a meeting of Jewish elders who plot the overthrow of world civilization. It's in fact rather a peculiar document put together from a French satire in the mid-19th century on Napoleon III, from parts of a German novel, a Gothic novel, and there's some Russian elements in it. It really wouldn't convince anybody, I don't think. And what I found was that its influence has been exaggerated. It really, people waved it about without actually reading it. What had the influence were commentators who wrote on it or provided footnotes to it, like Rosenberg, for example, Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi philosopher. But it's utterly unconvincing. And in the end, I concluded that Hitler, Goebbels, and the other leading Nazis were already deeply racist anti-Semites. Not really a kind of conspiracy theory, because they concluded that the urge to conspire is in the blood. It's inherited by Jews. A completely fantastic theory, of course. So it appeals mainly to people who are already anti-Semites. And then the second one is the so-called stab in the back legend. This is the idea put about by German generals at the end of the First World War that the army was undefeated, that it was stabbed in the back like Siegfried in the Siegfried legend or the Wagner music drama Götterdämmerung, by the home front. And there are kind of 3 versions of this. One is a general one. The home front collapsed and was unable to sustain the army at the front. The second is more precise. It's that the socialists and revolutionaries deliberately engineered the defeat of the army by staging a revolution. And the third is much narrower and more virulent, that it was the Jews who are the leaders of the socialist and communist movements in this version, who created the revolution and overthrew the army. Now, the relatively few Jews are the leadership of the communist and socialist movements in Germany. And in any case, the socialist movement during the war did its best to sustain the war effort, though it campaigned for a compromise peace without annexations, which annoyed the generals. And crucially, the German Revolution, which overthrew the Kaiser, happened after the defeat. The defeat happened on the Western Front. The Germans defeated the Russians, but in the Western Front, it happened in the summer, late summer, early autumn of 1918, as the German armies had no tanks. They were being beaten back by the Allies. They were running out of manpower. As the numbers killed were enormous. And Ludendorff, the leading general, already decided that there had to be a peace. Before the end of October. So this curiously did not really provide much of ammunition to the Nazis, though many people, historians have said it did, because the Nazis in the late 20s and early 30s were looking for votes, and they did not want to offend those civilians who had been on the home front in the First World War by accusing them of having stabbed the army in the back. So they kept rather quiet about it. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, insofar as it was a conspiracy theory, was what you might call a systemic conspiracy theory. The idea that a very large number of people are somehow driven to conspire in many different ways without necessarily a central organizing group. And this may happen as an anti-Semitic racist theory over many centuries and across many countries. The next theory that I look at is the Reichstag Fire, which has been called an event conspiracy theory. And that in some ways is the most common and in some ways the most interesting. The idea that the Reichstag, the German parliament building, was burnt down by, well, there's two versions of it. When it burnt down on the 27th, 28th of February, 1933, Hitler hadn't yet achieved power. He had been head of the government for a few weeks. And so he used it to get the President Hindenburg to pass a draconian emergency decree that suspended civil liberties. And this is renewed right up to the end of the Third Reich. It was one of the founding quasi-legal acts that created the dictatorship. And it was done on the basis of Hitler accusing the Communist Party, which was very large and very popular, had 100 seats in the Reichstag, of staging a coup d'etat. And it had some plausibility because they had staged a coup d'etat in Russia, after all, in 1917, and then tried in various other parts of East Central Europe in 1918, 1919. Actually, there was no truth in this. The Nazis put the leading, who they regarded as the leading conspirators on trial, but the courts had not yet been completely Nazified either. So they were acquitted by the Supreme Court in Leipzig. Only one person, by lack of evidence, only one person was actually found guilty, a Dutchman, Marinus van der Lubbe, a young man who was not even German, therefore, and not a communist either. He was an extreme leftist, what's called an anarcho-syndicalist. He was found guilty. He'd been found at the scene of the fire in the Reichstag and arrested. The communists put forward an alternative, an opposite conspiracy theory. The Nazis had started the fire. And that has, as English journalists say, it's had more legs. It's been able to, been repeated and revived. Incidentally, like the stab in the back legends recently been revived in Germany as well. The Reichstag Fire was said to have been started deliberately by the Nazis because they benefited from it. And that's one of the central principles of conspiracy theories that comes back again and again. Whoever benefits from something must have caused it. Jews, for example, benefited from the emancipation of the Jews as a religious minority after the French Revolution, in the French Revolution, and again in the 1848 revolutions. So they must have started these revolutions. And in this case as well, the Nazis benefited from the fire, so they must have started it. But again, there's no real proof for either of these theories. A lot of energy has been expended on trying to prove that the Nazis started the fire. And here, some other features of event conspiracy theories come in as well. For example, the argument that, well, if there isn't any evidence, it must have been suppressed. The documents must have been destroyed. Or if there aren't any eyewitnesses who can give you an eyewitness account that's corroborated by someone else, then the eyewitnesses must have been mysteriously murdered or disappeared. There's also forged documents have appeared as part of the case against the Nazis. And you find these in other conspiracy theories too. Find it in the fourth one that I look at, which is the flight of Rudolf Hess, the deputy leader of the Nazi party, who flew to Scotland on the 10th of May, 1941, to see the Duke of Hamilton. He seems to have done this on his own initiative to recover some of the power and influence he'd lost over the previous few years in the Nazi hierarchy. The evidence of him having flown on his own initiative, and he was a trained and experienced pilot, and is overwhelming. You just have to look at the many eyewitness descriptions of the scene when Hitler was handed a letter that Hess had instructed his adjutant to give him after he took off. Hitler was absolutely outraged, panicky, depressed, and all of the leading Nazis as well. Many, many accounts of this. Now Hitler, what Hess was doing was flying to Scotland to meet the Duke of Hamilton. There's another pilot, politically completely unimportant, who he imagined to be sympathetic to him, quite wrongly, and with a peace mission. But the peace mission was no real peace. Hitler certainly was not cognizant of it. He did not know about it. It was a very vague and feeble one, along the lines of, well, Britain can keep the British Empire, but has to leave apart from returning the parts of it which the lost German colonies confiscated by the League of Nations at the end of World War I. They had to be returned, and Germany had to have a free hand in Europe, which of course would have meant eventually the subjugation of the United Kingdom to Hitler's will. So Hess was imprisoned, and enormous amounts of ink had been spilt by conspiracy theorists in the UK, I have to say. It doesn't really cut much ice anywhere else, not really in Germany either, on trying to prove that Hitler knew about it, or that maybe he didn't, that MI5, the military intelligence, conspired to bring Hess over. The same things turn up: missing documents, suppression of evidence, mysterious deaths of people in the know, and so on. So there's a kind of pattern beginning to emerge. Finally, and I'll deal with this very briefly because I'm running up against the time limit now, but finally, the conspiracy theory that Hitler did not kill himself and his wife, Eva Hitler, on the 30th of April 1945 in the bunker underneath the Reich Chancellery, but escaped and went to live peacefully in Argentina for the rest of his life. Now, again, there's no evidence. You can pick all kinds of eyewitness reports of how the bodies were disposed of. You can pick a lack of evidence. Eva Braun was a professional photographer. There's lots and lots of home movies and pictures of Hitler up to the 30th of April 1945, not one single one afterwards. And you have to ask yourself, how would he have got out of Berlin when the Soviet Union, the Red Army, was already nearing the Reich Chancellery at that time? There are all kinds of extraordinary theories. He was substituted, and Eva Braun was substituted by doubles, by people who looked like them and escaped. And Hitler escaped sometime before the end. His secretaries and his adjutants just laughed at that. So how could they possibly have been fooled? And nobody seemed to have been in the conspiracy theories in the know about this either, because it's a kind of admiration for Hitler and his superhuman powers. How could he have died a squalid death by suicide underneath the bunker? He surely must have survived, although somebody with his political drive and ambition would certainly not have remained silent and in quiet retirement. So this is the most fantastic of these. Now you have to ask, why now? Why are all these theories? And there are others, and of course, my area, I've looked at them because this is my area of expertise. Why are there so many of them? Well, I think it's partly because of the internet and social media. I think they have bypassed the gatekeepers of opinion formation. Previously, newspaper, magazine, TV, radio editors could say, no, I'm not going to print this. I'm not going to publicize this because it's just too ridiculous. But on the internet, anybody can say anything. And that's how these have got a following, as it were. They serve various political purposes. We've seen a conspiracy theorist in the White House in the last 4 years, spinning all kinds of conspiracy theories. Hitler is a kind of supreme example of evil in a secularizing world. He's almost kind of replaces Satan. And so he's instantly recognizable. So all kinds of what you might call communities of alternative knowledge, flying saucer enthusiasts, people who hunt unidentified flying objects, occultists, and these appear in some of these conspiracy theories, particularly around Hitler's alleged escape. All kinds of other alternative fields of knowledge. I think people associate themselves with Hitler because it gains, or they think it gains them attention. And all of this, I think, is dangerous because it encourages a disbelief in the truth or in the possibility of the truth, or even says that truth doesn't matter. If you just think about it for a moment, these conspiracy theories are saying thousands and thousands of professional historians, professional investigators, experienced journalists have all been fooled. They've got it wrong. Or alternatively, they are all in on the conspiracy and they're all deliberately telling lies. That's profoundly, I think, not just insulting to us as historians, but it's also, I think, puts a question mark on how you find out about the truth and indeed the possibility of finding out about the truth. So that's why I think these conspiracy theories, and there are many, many more, are ultimately dangerous, not just to serious science and serious scholarship, but also a danger to democracy, because if a democracy can't depend on getting accurate knowledge about what is happening in the world, then we're all in deep trouble.
Thank you so much, Richard, for your very luminous and brilliant and also slightly threatening account of conspiracies, the Hitler conspiracies that resurface in these days. So please briefly allow me to give a few thoughts and lines of my own on conspiracy theories, because the question that arose for me when I read your beautiful book was, how new are these alleged new conspiracies really? You make the claim that conspiracies are with us since the time of the Catiline conspiracy, and Cicero already wrote about it. But there seems to be something novel with the conspiracies, the Hitler conspiracies, but also the way these conspiracies are on the increase today. But before we could start to answer that question and also ask ourselves, well, they're not new only, but they're also considered a threat to democracy, as you rightfully state. They're a concern to national security. But before we can further address this concern, I think it's also important to go back to the moment when conspiracies became a formalized concern of national security, because that was far later in history than the emergence of the first conspiracies in historiography. One could argue, and I'm about to, that conspiracy theories as a formalized concern of national security, the flip side of them being a threat to democracy, were formalized as such during the Age of Revolution, during the Napoleonic Age. A brief example. In the winter of 1791, Jacques Brissot, one of the revolutionary leaders, rallied the people of France to go to war with the rest of Europe with the following words. He said, "We need war to cleanse liberty from the vices of despotism. With our motherland facing an immense foreign conspiracy, it is now or never." And indeed, the assembly voted for war against Austria and later Prussia in 1792. And when then these revolutionary wars transitioned into the Napoleonic Wars, the rallying cry simply persisted. French revolutionaries, patriots, Bonapartists, they were on the same plane. They had to counter vast foreign reactionary conspiracies together. And in fact, to compound and disseminate and also to legitimate his claim to rule, Napoleon developed a propaganda machine, sending out daily dispatches throughout occupied Europe, stating his victories, shifting defeats onto these pernicious enemies, and rallying the people against these malevolent enemies, against these alleged royalist, monarchical, clerical conspiracies. And of course, I know military news bulletins were also en vogue in Prussia, in Britain, with the gazettes already in the 18th century. But Napoleon honed not just the idea of conspiracy to perfection, but also a propaganda apparatus to warn people against these foreign conspiracies. And he also created, well, it was already there in status nascendi, but with Fouché as police minister, he created a secret intelligence agency that produced bi-weekly reports of, quote of that time, I'm not inventing it, fausse nouvelles, fake news. So Napoleon, he saw conspiracies, he needed conspiracies to legitimize his rule, but he also was afraid of conspiracies, of fake news, of fausse nouvelles, because he knew that the French Revolution was, of course, a product of l'esprit public, the ghost of the public, the spirit of the public that rallied against the monarchs of yore. And he was afraid that they would do the same to him. So we could argue that, that's the claim that I'm trying to make here, that conspiracies have been a threat to rulers for ages and centuries. And they have been part of the fabric of history since its inception as a written tradition. But to become a proper institutionalized threat for national security and become an object of policing, that happened when Napoleon named Fouché his police minister to identify such conspiracies. So you, Richard, have pointed out that there is a direct relation between conspiracies and democracy. And of course, in situations of authoritarian rule, dissent, protests will inevitably be being seen as a conspiracy by the rulers in place. But to develop a whole machinery, a whole propaganda apparatus to deal with conspiracies, that was new, that wasn't there. And the point is, when Napoleon was defeated for the second time after 1815, the Allied powers and the countries of Europe, they kept these police apparatuses in place. And they also kept the threat of conspiracy as one of the main overarching priorities of national security agencies in place. And it was Wellington, the Duke of Wellington, who transplanted Fouché in Paris by a Berlin police director, Justus von Grüne. I wrote about this in my book. I found out that they already had an Allied security service in Paris in 1850. And this security service investigated conspiracies. And of course, this was also the precursor, one could say, to Metternich's Central Intelligence Agency in Carlsbad. So why is this, I think, important to state? Why would it still be relevant? Because I think it's of paramount importance to understand that the way we discuss democracy, freedom and security today has its roots not just in the times of terror and revolution, but also has its roots in the fear for terror and revolution as it has become institutionalized. And after the French Revolution, this fear was kept alive, partly by real conspiracies, partly by state agencies, by modern terror regimes that used those conspiracies to cement their rule, as the Nazis did with their fight against the Jews, as the communists did with their fight against alleged fifth columns. So over the past 200 years, conspiracies have become part and parcel of the way we discuss democracy as a rational enterprise, as you so rightfully stated, where fake news has no place. But we can state that, but the fact is that they are here, conspiracies. They're here in democracies, and they're also being used as we speak by populist regimes in Russia and Brazil to outwit enemies, to securitize proper oppositional opponents. And this is the problem that I have with dealing with conspiracies today. And in times such as ours, and crisis times, conspiracies flare up, but also the need to repress conspiracies flares up. And both can be equally detrimental to democracy. Conspiracies can, but also two repressive measures to wipe out conspiracies can be. And the big challenge seems to me to find new and creative ways to debunk the myths and the conspiracies, as your book is a marvelous example of. But we need to separate the wheat from the chaff. There are conspiracists, there are brokers, peddlers in lies, and they need to be debunked, sorted out, perhaps even banned from social media. But there are also so many individuals that tap into their lure because they perhaps rightfully distrust their governments in more autocratic regimes, or they are alienated from society. There was a report just came out in the United States that stated that 30% of the people that adhere to QAnon and also partly were amongst the rioters of the 6th of January, they suffered from depression and from mental illnesses. So they were not just ideologically deluded, they were also suffering. I'm not going to ask clemency for them, but there is something to conspiracy theories that makes it difficult to only securitize it, to only see it as a threat, because we can overshoot ourselves, overblow ourselves. And I think it's also important to state that conspiracies are there. Sometimes they're food for security agencies, sometimes they're real threats to democracy, but there's also severe pain and loss for the people who subscribe to these theories, and that cannot just be wiped away. So my point to claim at the end of my brief explanation is that it's so difficult to only counter conspiracies by rationalizing or trying to debunk them. And that is something that I would like to ask you to engage in discussion with me now. So thank you for listening to my brief comments. And my first question indeed would then be, do you think that the conspiracies that we surface today, are they indeed new? Is there a novel dimension to them that has to do with crisis or social media? Can you say something about that first?
Well, you raised a lot of questions there. I mean, I think there's, first, let me just make a few points. The first thing is that, of course, in debunking conspiracy theories, I am not saying that there have never been and never are any real conspiracies. There's a famous, in the literature, there's a famous thing called the Mitchell effect. So Martha Mitchell, the wife of Nixon's Attorney General, was informed that there'd been a break-in at the Watergate Hotel. And she said, I bet it was masterminded in the Oval Office. And people said, no, that's a conspiracy theory. You know, that's ridiculous. It turned out to be true. So some conspiracy theories turn out to be true. The second thing to say is that, yeah, it is important to debunk them, to get into them and show where they go wrong. And one of the interesting things that my little debunking exercise in this book is that you can begin to see common features of how conspiracy theorists cope with the lack of evidence, for example, I'd already mentioned. But other things are very important as well. And what you might call the security angle is it's now, I think, it's becoming increasingly common, importantly, for social media and other companies like Facebook and Twitter to either bar conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones, for example, from using, or even Donald Trump from using the social media, and that does have a big effect, or to flag up obvious untruths in the when they find them on posts. That raises some very difficult questions of censorship and how far you can regulate public opinion without beginning to erode freedom of speech. But nevertheless, I think that is very important. Then I think on a bigger historical scale, there's an important distinction to be drawn between governments that use conspiracy theories, often entirely conjuring up entirely imaginary conspiracies, as a tool of control and of sustaining their rule, and conspiracy theories that emerge from like the people, from outside the government milieu. Broadly speaking, when you have a repressive, controlled system in which there's very little freedom of expression and there's no legal way to oppose the government, as in, for example, Tsarist Russia, then the government, or indeed in Metternich Europe, then you get governments begin to suspect everybody of conspiracies, because conspiracy is the only way you can oppose the government. Conspiracy, of course, has to be in secret, has to involve two or more people. The more people are involved in conspiracy, the more likely it is to be uncovered, to be betrayed. half a dozen in the great conspiracy to kill Hitler in 1944 in Germany. There are a large number of people involved, and they were beginning to be arrested already before the plot came to fruition. Stalin is a great example of a leader who used conspiracy theories to get rid of people he imagined were his rivals, or to try and account for his mistakes. So it's very dangerous. The biggest threat to democracy is actually when a government starts peddling conspiracy theories. And you can see this in many authoritarian governments. You can see, and very often they have some kind of external enemy who may or may not be an enemy, but then they're used. Stalin used Trotsky, whom he alleged was conspiring against him and causing all sorts of problems in Russia, in the Soviet Union. Viktor Orban in Hungary uses George Soros, who also happens to be Jewish, and there's an anti-Semitic tinge to that. In Turkey, it's Gulen. There are many examples of this. So in looking at the origins of conspiracy theories that you talked about, and I think this has been my final sentence of the response, is really, it kind of begins, it's all connected with the conspiracy theory about the origins of the French Revolution. And you get this emerging very quickly in the 1790s when royalists and conservatives begin to say, well, there's surely some kind of conspiracy must have caused the overthrow of the monarchy. Illuminati, Freemasons, and that's then, there's a resurgence of that in the 1848 revolutions. In the wake of them, there is a connection between revolution and conspiracy in the conservative mind. I think we cannot accept that revolutions are sometimes brought about by mass popular uprising. So nowadays, in most countries, in democracies, we have conspiracy theories flourishing because people demand openness of government, and the more democratic a society, the more open a government has to be, and when necessarily governments have to have secrets. So there's a widespread suspicion of government as itself conspiring against the people in some way or another. And then finally, just let me answer your question, I hope. It's a matter of communication. Okay, so conspiracy theories, you can point to the Rhineland in 1349 in the Middle Ages, in the Black Death, is ravaging Europe, and the Jews are really in Western Central Europe the only religious minority in a Christian Europe, and they are then suspected of or accused of poisoning the wells, because people can't explain why there are so many terrible deaths in bubonic plague. And so there are massacres, terrible massacres of the Jews, but it's limited geographically because it's all done by word of mouth. People go from one town to the next and say, it's the Jews are poisoning the wells. Again, a completely fanciful, absurd conspiracy theories. It's a scapegoat there. By the time you get to French Revolution, it's a print medium. You get pamphlets and posters and broadsides and broadsheets and so on, conjuring up these conspiracy theories. And then you get to the age of radio and television, and now the internet. And each time, with each step in speeding up and broadening the scope of communications, you get more conspiracy theories that spread more widely. And now we have instantaneous, uncontrolled, unregulated communication. And that's, I think, is a big reason why we have so many in the present day.
Thank you so much for your elaborate answer, Richard. If I may take that last sentence up, you say, well, conspiracies thrive and are being propelled by new revolutions also in the communication media. And I think I totally agree with you there. But do you think the latest revolution in communication and transportation media, the internet revolution, has that qualitatively changed the way we deal with conspiracies or the way our society suffer from conspiracies? Is this just a quantitative dimension, or has the internet also changed the way we now have to deal with conspiracies? And for example, this new rise of the Hitler conspiracies that you speak about, is that different because of the internet, and how would it be different?
Well, the conspiracy theories that I deal with in my book Some of them are old and are being revived, like the stab in the back legend. Some of them are relatively new. So if you look at the conspiracy theory that Hitler escaped the bunker and went to live in Argentina, that's already around just a few weeks after he died, spread by Stalin. Stalin was a natural conspiracy theorist, and you can find him in others as well. In the flight of Rudolf Hess, for example, he's also there spreading conspiracy theories. So with Hitler, he wanted to kind of disturb the Allies, to create uncertainty, and also to justify his continued presence of the Red Army in half of Europe, in case Hitler came back like Napoleon had come back. So there are various motives that he has. And there are all sorts of reports of sightings of Hitler, which get sent to the FBI, and they have to investigate them. In every single case, they concluded there was absolutely no truth in the sightings, reported sightings of Hitler. But their substantial files of these reported sightings are a staple documentary basis for many of the claims advanced nowadays. But you have many other new conspiracy theories about Hitler having escaped the bunker. So it's a question of quantity and of content as well. There are relatively few real conspiracy theories in the 50s. Now there is a whole enormous variety of them. So I do think we have a larger number of them and many more different kinds.
And if I further go down that road, there's more of them. It's become a market. The internet is a flourishing market, a commodification of all kinds of conspiracies. It fits into this infotainment consumer strategy,
yes.
Also peddled by the big tech giants. Yet there also needs to be an audience that buys into them. And would you say, you made a brief reference to that in the beginning of your talk, would you say that conspiracies can become new, almost sectarian-like movements? Could they be ecologies where believers find a kind of solace, find a kind of home? That's what many people who subscribe to QAnon now start to say. It's their kind of religion almost. Could you say something about that?
That's right, yes. I mean, previously, if you look at the 1950s and 60s, you find conspiracy theories tend to be rather isolated. Now, with social media, you can immediately locate other people who share your views or share some version of them. And that gives you the feeling that you're part of a larger movement. And I think more important in a way is what you said about infotainment, the idea of entertainment through these conspiracy theories. And then you get, you get the question of belief. Do people really believe this stuff? Well, there's a television series on the History Channel called Hunting Hitler. It's had 24 episodes with an average viewing number of over 3 million people. I think if you asked them if they really believed it, that he'd escaped. Some do, clearly. You just have to look at Twitter, and there's a lot of stuff there by fanatical believers. But a lot might just say, well, it's rather fun. I enjoyed it. They're slick TV programs. They're fun to watch, maybe or maybe not. And in fact, the programs don't present a single piece of evidence. There's a wonderful review of the first program in Vanity Fair, I think, that said, if you drunk a slug of whiskey for every time they said, well, he might have been here, he could have done this, somebody could have possibly have seen him, you'd be completely sloshed by the first ad break. So it's all speculation and it's all conjecture. I think what you said about, as it were, solace or reassurance is important. You do find that a relatively high proportion of people who believe in conspiracy theories do so as a way of self-validation. After all, what you're saying is, and if you feel marginalized or shut out of the political process or denied access to mainstream institutions, you say, all right, all of these professors, all of these politicians, everybody, they're all wrong. I know the real truth.
Mm-hmm. Then you made the difference, you discerned in your book between systemic conspiracy theories and more singular ones.
Event focused, yeah.
That I found very helpful distinction. You could also, on top of that, make another distinction between irrelevant or harmless conspiracies and harmful ones. And people also in the chat, I'm now reading also the questions that people in the audience pose, and this resonates with the question I had as well, is if you take the more harmful conspiracies, they oftentimes pivot around anti-Semitic tropes.
Yeah.
So why do these tropes persist? And doesn't this make conspiracy theories especially harmful as compared to, for example, the Hitler myth that he fled from his bunker? Well, that's not completely harmless, but perhaps there's this distinction that such anti-Semitic, Soros-like or QAnon conspiracies that follow up on this old blood libel idea that Jewish people are slaughtering children and that now our elites are doing that as well. Could you say something about that? Why does that persist so much?
Well, if you're looking at what we call a systemic conspiracy theory, that over a long period of time, all across the world, some institution like the Freemasons or some racial group like the Jews have been undermining civilization, then and fomenting all kinds of conspiracies. You need for that a group of people, a relatively large group of people who are located all the way across the world. If you said that the Welshmen, such as myself, Welshmen are engaged in a massive conspiracy theory to destroy civilization, you'd be laughed out of court because the Welshmen are basically, only in Wales, so a few in London, like when I grew up. But you need someone like George Soros, who is extremely wealthy, is Jewish. He uses his fortune not to buy a football club in Britain, as so many Russian oligarchs have done, but actually to support democratic politics and democratic institutions like the Central European University or the opposition to Robert Mugabe or the Democratic Party and so on. So that kind of lends a certain, in the minds of conspiracists, a certain plausibility to the idea that this person or this institution or this racial group, this ethnic group, or this religion is engaged in a worldwide conspiracy. Incidentally, you find this also before the French Revolution in Enlightenment monarchs like the emperor, the King of Prussia or the Emperor of Austria, who have conspiracy theories about the Jesuits. Because again, and suppress them. They ban the Jesuits because the Jesuits have this European, indeed global reach. They're a major missionary organization. They're seen as being a conspiratorial group trying to destroy the European state system. So that, I think, is why you have this. And also the QAnon conspiracy theories is now very widespread. It alleges that Hillary Clinton and George Soros and all sorts of other liberal hate figures for extreme right-wingers have been kidnapping and torturing young children and extracting adrenaline from their glands. And this is a modern version of, as you said, the blood libel, which in Christian medieval Europe, there were quite a lot of cases where Jews were accused of, and remember, religious minority, were accused of kidnapping Christian boys and drinking their blood in some kind of satanic ceremony, or satanic ritual. So you find this, the QAnon is a modern version of that. It is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory.
There's also a question which directly ties into this in the chat, that if there are so many people who probably, just like the Nazis did, not actually believe in the fact that Clinton and the like are really drinking the blood of children, Some of them are, but some of them just follow the rallying cries because there's a higher truth at stake, as with the Nazis, as with QAnon now. And you could say with QAnon sympathizers nowadays, it's a kind of a power critique. It's people taking back what they feel has been taken from them, power, participation, whatever. This is a more emancipatory take on conspiracy theories. I find it difficult to follow that interpretation, but I know that a lot of sociologists and also some of my colleagues, they also explain that conspiracy theories may be pernicious, they may be perverse even, but they still mirror a kind of an emancipatory claim towards a higher truth, to want to have a say in power. How do you feel about those explanations?
Well, it is more compensation for what they perceive to be a lack of power. In our Cambridge project, we had enough funds to engage an opinion poll company. YouGov, it's called. It has a special arrangement with the Cambridge Political Science Department. And we did some opinion polls, which before Brexit found that the UKIP, the so-called United Kingdom Independence Party, led by Nigel Farage, which was very popular, actually won the European elections in Britain, the last ones. And that their supporters were much more inclined to believe in conspiracy theories than those of the Conservatives or Labour or Liberal Democrats of the mainstream parties. And clearly Brexit, and in particular the kind of active side of UKIP, the Brexit Party, was a vehicle for people who felt excluded from the political process. So the two went together. It has this compensatory factor, I think.
Yes, and if we take this as a status report on how the situation is in Britain, and to a certain extent also in the Netherlands, and especially in the United States as well, where would you start? I mean, you've written your book, you put obviously lots of energy and investment in your book to debunk the myths. Do you think that's enough to rationally, carefully, meticulously debunk the myths, or do you need to engage with that sense of loss and compensation as well? And where would you start?
Well, unfortunately, it's not enough. And I hope that my book will be able to at least persuade relatively unbiased people that these conspiracies did not happen, or that they didn't have any influence. As particularly in the case of the flight of Rudolf Hess to Scotland and the Reichstag Fire, where now serious mainstream historians are having doubts. And I think they're wrong to have doubts. They're clearly acts of one lone person. And there are also certain belief structures that, a lot of people find it very difficult to believe that one person with one act, like burning the Reichstag down or flight to Scotland, can change history. There must have been a larger group. It's also to do with the information overload that we're suffering from now, with 24/7 news channels, with many different sources of information, including particularly social media, of course, and the internet. Conspiracy theories simplify. Whatever happens must have been the result of somebody intending it to happen, and intention is a key part of a conspiracy theory. Randomness, chance, accident is eliminated from the belief system of any conspiracy theorist. So all of these things, I think, are very important in terms of answering why people believe in conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theorists themselves, the ones who spin out the conspiracy theories rather than just saying that they believe in them or follow them, they live by and large in a closed mental universe where you cannot penetrate it with rational argument or unbiased objective evidence. It's a self-sealing belief system. So if you have if you present the evidence, they'll just say without any evidence of their own that it's falsified or it doesn't mean what it says. They will not actually look at the evidence. If you want somebody who believes that Hitler ordered Hess to fly to Scotland, and you say to them, why don't you look at the contemporary eyewitness reports of Hitler's reactions? They won't look at it. And if you persist, they will then start saying it you yourself. are part of the conspiracy. We had, of course, a lot of suspicion in our project in Cambridge from conspiracy theorists, but once they had discovered that Lord Leverhulme, whose fortune funded the late Lord Leverhulme, set up the trust and funded our project, was a Freemason, then that was enough for them.
And the Welsh rule the world after all, don't they, Richard?
If only, Beatrice, if only.
No, but there are some questions about this as well. If you leave aside those very hardcore conspiracy theorists who completely are isolated and immune against any form of rational democratic inoculation, how would you then start to approach people that are hesitant or that find solace? And there are now voices coming from the extremism studies that I also work in sometimes who say, well, it doesn't serve to bring counter narratives. It doesn't serve to discuss rationally with people. What really helps them is giving them therapy, giving them a listening ear, giving them support, moral support, because these people, they're in distress sometimes. There's this company, it's called Moonshot Company in London, and it does this research and it develops therapy for getting people outside these almost sectarian bubbles. How do you feel about that? Did you do research or your group about this?
Well, I don't think that belief in conspiracy theories, or actually the creation and distribution of conspiracy theories, is a matter of individual pathology. I don't think there are social psychologists who look into this problem and see it as a psychological problem of the individual. But I don't, that may be the case for a small number, but it's a bigger problem, a more widespread and more intractable problem than that, I think. So I do think it is important to spread, as far as you can, to spread the truth. It's essential. So I had a lot to do with Holocaust denial, for example, over the years, particularly 20 odd years ago in a famous trial in London. There are websites like discourse, for example, which have a huge amount of information, documentation about the Holocaust. And you can, if there are doubters and people on the fringes who believe it, entertain the belief that it didn't happen, then you can steer them towards these websites. Education is a very important factor as well. It's important, I think, to educate people, educate children and school students about conspiracy theories like Holocaust denial, which essentially posits that the Holocaust never happened and there's been a massive conspiracy to cover up the fact that it didn't happen, involving millions of historians, commentators, politicians, and all the rest of it. It's completely fantastic and absurd idea. So you can steer people towards these sources, but that's only one way of dealing with harmful conspiracy theories. And I don't actually, to come back to your earlier question, think that any conspiracy theories are harmless. There are degrees of harmfulness, of course. So QAnon, I think, is deeply harmful. But if you take, say, the conspiracy theory that the moon landings in 1969 happened in a Hollywood studio, that's harmful because it's casting doubt on our ability to discover the truth. I took part in a symposium on this on the anniversary of the landings at the Science Museum in London, where we had various space experts and so on. You can explain absolutely every piece of pseudo evidence that the conspiracy theorists point to. That you can say it's quite clear that audiovisual technology was not good enough to fake those moon landings. And if you look at them saying, well, look at the flag when they plant it on the moon, it's waving, there must have been a breeze. That's just because there's no resistance, and so it vibrates, all right? And eventually over time, it transfers its vibration to the moon. So there are many, and of course, space technology was advanced enough to put people on the moon in 1969.
So you even would say that the Bielefelder conspiracy is harmful? You heard about that one?
You mean the Bilderberg? Or
No, the Bielefelder conspiracy.
no,
For
I don't
people,
know.
well, that's a kind of a running gag mostly. That's the Bielefelder conspiracy, and it surfaces in many television shows in Germany, stating that the mere existence of Bielefeld is a conspiracy. Bielefeld doesn't exist. And if you claim otherwise, you're part of that conspiracy.
Well,
But
that
that
sounds
is
like
kind of a running gag. That's a kind of a joke.
Yes.
Yeah.
But even then, you know, of course, we all know, I hope, that BFL does exist. It has
Yes,
one of the world's ugliest universities that I've been to. But there again, you know, if you look at it seriously, the evidence that Bielefeld exists is overwhelming. So if anyone takes it seriously, that's a bad thing.
Yes. There is a question about this as well. It says so, and I'm reading it aloud now. In early days, it seems that conspiracies were mainly politically driven. Today, lots of them seem more economically driven, meaning that the creators, the propellers, are making good money maintaining all these conspiracies. What is your view, Professor Evans, on there possibly being an economic driving force behind the sprawl of conspiracies today, more so than in earlier days?
Well, I think I'm not sure that's true. It's just there are so many more conspiracy theories now. But if you look at anti-Semitism, that has always had a significant economic component. That conspiracy theory that the Jews somehow are taking money from Christians, or more recently from people of other races, as that anti-Semitism became racialized about a century and a half ago. So if you look at the Middle Ages, because the Catholic Christianity outlawed money lending, the Jews were often bankers and money lenders, and that aroused enormous amounts of resentment and so on, as behind many conspiracy theories about the Jews. And that, again, I think is in a revived form, is part of the conspiracy theorizing about George Soros, who's a very wealthy man, who I have to say is, of course, entirely innocent of all these conspiracy theories. He thinks of himself as a philosopher, and just because he's a liberal, I think has become the butt of extreme right-wing conspiracies. So money is an important. If you look at 1873, that's a significant moment, because in Germany, the post-unification boom suddenly became a crash, and and the result was the formation of explicitly anti-Semitic political parties that wanted to deprive the Jews of their rights. And they were based on appealing to peasants and artisans who'd suddenly become poor, because not being able to understand it because of financial crash, directing their resentments towards Jewish bankers. And Jewish bankers have always been the object of conspiracy theories, even though they've been a minority. As August Bebel, the leader of the Social Democrats in pre-1914 Germany, said, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools, because you're blaming Jews for exploiting you, whereas in fact you should be blaming capitalism, which has no, racial connotations.
When you started saying after the German unification, I briefly thought that you were referring to the latest German reunification, because after 1989, 1990, in the new German Bundesländer, there was also a huge rise of anti-Semitic right-wing extremism, and still is today, and neo-Nazis marching again.
Yeah.
Also driven by economic anxiety, but also by sheer racism and anti-Semitism, and the lack, of course, of a proper Vergangenheitsbewältigung
Exactly.
so it's there as well.
Also, it's the lack of any deep-rooted democratic political culture. Whereas in the former West Germany, there's 40 years of democracy. In East Germany, it's democracy, freedom of expression. All of those things were new in 1990, and there'd not been a proper confrontation with the past. These Germans were taught to identify with the communist resistance to Nazism, not to accept some kind of responsibility for themselves.
But you now seem to say, sorry to bring this up, but it's quite a substantial point that we need to solve, I hope, be able to solve in the last minutes. You seem to say here that democracy is a proper antidote against conspiracies. because you were just saying that the reason of there being so many conspiracies is because of the lack of proper democratic training for the past 40 years. But you could also...
Sorry,
no, sorry. This is a brief summary, but you made a kind of relation with democracy. But my question would be to you, Richard, couldn't you also say that democracy also produces new conspiracy theories of people that feel that democracy doesn't treat them correctly, and they use their democratic rights to vent their criticism? And then you could even say that conspiracies are part of modernity's conundrum. The more modernity, the more democracy, the more participation, the more people feel that they're not being heard enough. And perhaps you could say that conspiracy is the plight, is as common as, well, that there was religion and now we have these conspiracy ecologies as part of a modernity. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd use the term modernity, but certainly democratic political systems are no less susceptible to conspiracy theorizing than authoritarian ones. The idea of the problem of Eastern Europe, in which one includes the new Bundesländer, is that the Eastern European countries have a very shallow democratic political culture, but that's what that leads to is a weakness of democracy. It's not a way of explaining conspiracy theories, and the various movements, right-wing, ultra-right, post-fascist movements, which are most popular in the former East German Bundesländer, like Pegida or the Alternative für Deutschland, they are anti-democratic because therefore they are weaker in West Germany than in the former West German provinces, because there's a deeper commitment to democracy among the population there. But that's a separate question from belief in conspiracy theories. Of course, there are crossovers and so on, but and as I said earlier, the more open a society is, the more possible it is to express opposition to government in public without being arrested and imprisoned. The more people tend to demand openness and transparency from government itself, and so the more suspicious they are of government, and so the more likely they are to develop conspiracy theories, but the object of them is usually some idea of, excuse me, of government. So the idea that's very widespread in American right-wing conspiracy theories is that there is a world government behind the scenes, what they call the New World Order, and that's bound up with QAnon as well, that secretly Obama and Soros and all kinds of other liberals have established a world government. There's even one former associate of Donald Trump and of Alex Jones, a conspiracy theorist called Jerome Corsi, who has published a book arguing for the survival of Hitler in Argentina after 1945, and tried to argue that Hitler was taken there by the CIA, spirited out, but he was cultivated by the Americans because Nazism would then help them establish this new world order. And then you get that, join the dots, and you end up with that accusation that Obamacare, state subsidized medical care, is Nazi.
So thank you, Richard, for that convincing answer. Two last questions, please. I'll take them together. The first one is, do you think that conspiracies today have become or can become a new kind of political religion? So is there something towards them that perhaps makes them step into the secularized world?
Conspiracy theories, yeah.
Yes, and well, my other question is more of a personal nature. Where do you find your energy? You're so indomitable, fighting conspiracies, debunking the most ridiculous, ludicrous theories. Where do you get your energy from? Why are you doing this?
Well, the first one is, I don't really accept the concept of political religion. I think religion necessarily must involve an element of the supernatural, belief in some kind of god or gods. And the fact is, if you look at, say, fascism or Nazism, let alone communism, these are essentially secular movements. Hitler did tend to use religious imagery and language when he was fighting elections in the early 1930s. It's an appeal to the religious constituency, particularly Protestantism in Germany. But he went on record in 1938, public speech, saying Nazism is a scientific, secular movement. We don't want anything to do with these, particularly the sort of pseudo-religions that Himmler and Rosenberg were propagating. So I think it does consume the lives of the people who propagate and spread conspiracy theories. It does become a kind of central belief for them, but I don't think you can describe it as a religion. And the second one, well, I mean, I've always wanted to be a historian from about the age of 10 or 11. I've always been completely fascinated by the past. And one thing that I come back to again and again and again is, how do you tell truth from fiction? To me, that is a kind of really central question that historians have to try and answer. So I've tried to tackle it from various angles in short books that deal with this, whether it's, as you said, the little book, Alternative Pasts on, Altered Pasts on What If, on counterfactuals. And of course, what if questions are also important in the conspiracy theories that I deal with. You know, if the protocols of the Elves of Zion hadn't existed, would there have been no Holocaust? If Hess hadn't, or if Hitler hadn't, you know, there are always alternatives. There are always what if only, which is more or less the same thing. If only Hitler had escaped to Argentina, then wouldn't everything be better and so on. So I've always tried, and I wrote a book called In Defense of History, which tried to tackle this about some rather frighteningly now, a quarter of a century ago, another short book about it. And this is another attempt to look at the difference, the borderlines between truth and fiction, and how can you actually find out about the truth. I think it's a central existential question, and one that completely that grips me, and I try and I come back to it again and again. I had a friend called Mikulash Teich, who's a historian of science, and he died at the age of 100 not long ago. And I visited him when he was 99, and I found him surrounded by books, piles of books. He was sitting there in his sitting room. And I said, what are all these books, Mikulash? He said, they're books about the truth. What is truth? I'm very worried about truth, he said. So you can keep going. A big question like that can keep you going.
And I also think that this is a question that's very much at home at the place where I'm virtually sitting here in our church. And a search for eternal truth can keep you going and going. So I have not been able to raise all the questions that were put to you in the chat. I apologize to the people who posed them. I try to weave as much questions into our interview as possible. For the rest, I urge the people to really read Rich's books and also browse his many interviews, and there are many beautiful lectures, the one that you gave for the Royal Society, for example, and others, to hear more about his work. So Richard, thank you very much for tonight, and I'm now handing over to Mark for the concluding words.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. It's been a pleasure.
For both of you for enlightening us. There's a lot of good insights and information, and also maybe debunking of some conspiracies in itself already. I urge anyone to read the book of Sir Evans and all the other literature he's written, and as well as Professor de Graaf has written. I thank you both for the wonderful time we've had. This concludes the end of the evening. Thank you to all viewers, maybe listeners in the background, for tuning in tonight and for posing all your questions. Like Professor de Graaf has already said, they have been wonderful questions. We may not have been able to answer all of them, but we do really agree that you can learn more in all the literature, and maybe also in one of the future events that we may have, because at the end of this stream, we will show you a couple of the future events that we will have. One of them will be a via podcast in which Professor Graaf will continue elaborating on this subject, on the debate in itself, but also more of the information. Maybe it's possible to hand in questions beforehand, but we'll have to configure that with her and the organizers of the podcast themselves. Also, if we are allowed, we'd like to open the church for a silent reading party on several dates. Maybe you can read one of the books that you can buy online via the website ViaJacobidebat or via the bookstore Bruce. Therefore, a reduced price available until tomorrow at the end of the day. So make sure to check that out via our website too. And we will also host also in online sessions, most likely via philosophy evenings, in which we will also debate about the concept and the consequences of truth, post-truth, and fake news. So be sure to join us then. And once again, thank you all for listening, viewing, and one final note. These events are being organized by us, and we hope and we aim for everyone to attend, if possible. But it does cost time and money. So if you consider a donation as a thank you to us, please stick around and to see where you can possibly donate. So once again, a big thank you for our two speakers, and also a big thank you for you all. And we hope to see you soon, and we hope to see you physically in the church as soon as possible. But yes, that is still up for debate. So thank you all, and have a very good evening.